Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks again for this stimulating speech. I think that was perfect to take us to the next panel, which is on AI. And I'm very happy that Ariel Ezrachi is going to chair this panel. Ariel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Oli, just make a statement. Hey, everyone. As you see, we're going to be joined by two people remotely in a minute. So we had, 2 years ago, we had a discussion on AI and competition, and we sat here, and at the time, slightly early days of LLMs, and it was obvious that there are some issues with concentration and some issues with the level of competitiveness along the supply chain. But what was also clear is that there is a clear challenge when it comes to identifying the adequate level of intervention. Should we intervene? Should we allow innovation to flourish? What could be the impact? Now, we're 2 years later. We're definitely older, perhaps slightly wiser. And in AI time, this is really ancient history, whatever we were thinking 2 years ago, because when you look at the technology, it is moving at an insane speed. I mean, you have these days AI developing the next generation of AI. You have AI that is affecting all facets of our livelihood, from the workplace to labor, to community relationship, communications, economy, politics, and of course, also investments and innovation. So this is really a transformative moment for us. From the human perspective, there are massive questions when it comes to human autonomy, to the impact this will have on us. Of course, here, our focus is on the competition aspects. But I wanted to highlight the wider human element, because if you appreciate how important this technology is to us, this is something that is everywhere, all the time, something that will impact across any aspect of our lives, then it becomes obvious how important it is for us to try and make sure that we give those markets the best chance they have to be as competitive as possible. The issues, or let's say the key areas that we tend to worry about are, of course, power, where there are real worries about the consolidation of the market. Part of it could be a natural outcome of the characteristics of the technology in the market. Part of it may be the result of consolidation, mergers and acquisitions, acqui-hires, collaborations. Part of it may be the result of exclusionary practices. And indeed, we have already some interesting cases of leveraging, preferencing, tying contractual terms that seem to undermine certain aspects of competition. And of course, we also have exploitation. We heard earlier today about RealPage. RealPage is relatively old technology of hub and spoke. Of course, with AI, we have new concerns when it comes to pricing, the dynamism of markets, and ripple effects that deal with innovation, trajectory of innovation, heterogeneity of innovation, toxic innovation, and society, wider elements of society in terms of democracy, etc. In Europe, as we heard earlier today, there is also a unique aspect of growth and sovereignty, and this certainly colors the discussion to some extent. So really a lot to discuss, and what we'll try to do in the next hour and so is to try and approach some of those elements and get a sense of where we stand and what is the likely trajectory in terms of the technology and enforcement. And we're very fortunate to have really a fantastic group of panelists with us. I'll start by introducing them very, very quickly. Johannes Reck, co-founder, chief executive of GetYourGuide in Berlin. Fiona Morton, professor of economics at Yale University. Oliver Bethell, head of competition regulatory engagement and advisory at Google. Andy Chen, vice chairperson and acting chairperson, Fair Trade Commission in Taipei. And joining us remotely, Udbhav Tiwari, Vice President, Strategy and Global Affairs at Signal Foundation, and Alexander Schellong, Executive Vice President, Institute, Accelerators, and Security Schwarz digits. So really, we have perspectives from business, from industry, from law, economics, policy, gives us a lovely opportunity to get some insights and also hear your thoughts. So what I would like to do, Andy, is actually start with you, because the Taiwan Fair Trade Commission, as we know, completed a public consultation looking at the issues arising from AI with the aim of formulating guiding policies. And I think it would be actually quite a nice way for us to frame the discussion by you just sharing with us what are the key insights, what are the challenges that you identified.
Okay, thank you, Ariel, and I'm grateful for the Bundeskartellamt for having me here. The Taiwan Fair Trade Convention, we conducted a public consultation on the competitive issue in generative AI industry. I think the purpose is to better capture the reality of a market which is rapidly evolving, and it also represents our response to the public call for enforcement grounded in empirical evidence. Can you put up the slide one? I prepare a background slide for you to follow my presentation. We organized the question of the public consultation into 7 broad topics. We ask first, whether and to what extent the restriction of access to key input for generative AI has impacted market competition. And some opinions raise the concern that the high cost from using GPU from the server, from the data center, has actually imposed a significant cost for the local and the small, medium-sized company to compete effectively with the large firms. But by contrast, we also have the opinions indicating that the competition among big players has actually triggered an in-house chip development. So there's a different side opinion from this question. And with respect to the self-preferencing and the switching costs in the cloud service market, some of the respondents suggest that, yes, some big company might implement a strategy such as the capability prioritization or steep discounts tied to the use of specific model, and thereby create the potential of the ecosystem lock-in. But I think the majority opinion on this question is that local company actually follow and practice a multi-homing strategy. They will use various type of the computing service based on their individual needs and the data gravity. And with respect to tie-in and the ecosystem integration, some of the opinion mention that in theory, the use of specific AI model might require the compatibility of specific software, which might in turn create the problem of ecosystem lock-in again. But I think the majority opinion responded that at this moment, there is really no tie-in problem in the AI market in Taiwan. And domestic and international firms have very, very different view about telemobility. International company, quite predictably, they argue that the telemobility is quite vibrant, which could be evidenced by the increasing number of new entrants and a new startup in the AI market. However, the domestic market argue that actually it is quite financially demanding to train talents in the AI market. They make an example. For example, if you want to train an expert in building the language model, it takes at least 2 years to 6 years to train a PhD level expertise. And even at the level of application, it requires still 6 months to 2 years to train an expert in developing the application model. And with respect to the acquisition and the partnership arrangement, some opinion argue that this kind of arrangement could create the potential for self-preferencing and exclusive dealing. But of course, some also argue that the collaboration creates the possibility of innovation, which could not be done by individual company. And with respect to concerted practice, I think most opinion responded that At this moment, what kind of impacts the AI will create on consultative practice is still remain unknown, unclear. But it's very interesting to find that a local trade association kind of urges us to be open-minded in making a market assessment on this issue, because they think the market competition will be shifted into non-price competition as the algorithmic competition and also the price transparency getting more and more stronger. I think the focus of competition should be on quality, service. So you strongly encourage to place attention on these non-price competition issues. And despite all this difference in opinion from the public consultation, we do observe two broad points of consensus. First, AI competition is increasingly ecosystem-based. And the competition agencies should be mindful of taking this kind of new type of competition into consideration when making market competition assessment. And secondly, most opinions argue and suggest that because the AI is still in the early phase of development, so premature and excessive regulation should be very cautious. I think in the interest of time, I will just stop here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andy. And Fiona, let's build on that. And we have a very nice framework. Let's talk a little bit more about bottlenecks and what is the impact? Where do you see the problems?
Yeah, we're probably going to have problems because these are technologies with the usual large fixed cost, low marginal cost, and network effects and data effects, economies of scale. So we should be worried ex ante. I think you can step through them in the usual way and think about chips, for example, where we have NVIDIA with a very large position, but also in new investments and partnerships with firms like AMD and Intel and Google's internal effort, the TMU. Then we have compute, which can be built by anybody in principle, but I think we see that there are existing cloud hyperscalers that have serious competencies and economies of scale again. Energy. There's a big concern we heard this morning about space. Will this remain a competitive part of the stack, or will it be dominated by one company? My view is that Northern Europe actually has a lot of possibilities in this regard, like Iceland. Then we've got foundation models where at present there's an oligopoly. We have data where there has been a big problem of the incumbents taking the data without proper permission. We've got issues like Google having YouTube creators without the ability to opt out of their content being used to train Google's model. Application models, there seems to be much more scope for variety and differentiation and size. And then a huge issue is distribution. Distribution to end consumers in particular is dominated by the tech platforms that we're already very familiar with. And this is going to cause, I think, huge issues.
And just I wonder, kind of briefly, to what extent would you associate the position that we find ourselves as the result of the natural characteristics of the market? And to what extent would you think that this is either the result of maybe antitrust not rising to the challenge, or maybe the flip side of the coin, exclusionary practices or consolidations?
Yep. I think that, well, so first let me amend my first answer to say this is a moving problem. So what I said will probably be out of date by tomorrow, but that is part of the problem caused by past lax enforcement, I think, surely. So why do we have Google as the deliverer of search as a monopoly? Because we were not able to enforce quickly enough and impose a remedy. And then if you let the past dominant firm control the evolution to the next technology, then you are stopping innovation and the level playing field from doing its work. So if you think about AT&T in telecommunications, which was prevented by an antitrust enforcement from going into computing, IBM prevented by antitrust enforcement from going into software, Microsoft prevented by antitrust enforcement from dominating the internet, Google, we had an antitrust case, but it didn't do anything. And so I think we find ourselves here in large part, no jurisdiction, right? It's not like my accent, the jurisdiction of my accent did any better than this one. So I think we just have to be extremely cautious at this point.
And that's the new test for jurisdiction, accent-based, just so you know. Now, so we understand a bit more about, let's say, the power blocks that we have. And Johannes, I want to move to you because you operate downstream, so you experience that on a daily basis. What has been your experience, or what can you share with us from knowing the industry about this relationship of operating with bigger upstream companies, possible leveraging?
So first of all, a pleasure to be back at this conference. Really enjoyed it 2 years ago. And for those of you who haven't seen my speech back then, I'm Johannes Reck. I'm the CEO of GetYourGuide. We are a Berlin-based company with a global market leader in experiences. Roughly 30 to 40 million people use our platform every year. We have roughly 4 billion of transaction volume, 1 billion of revenues. And continue to grow in a very exciting segment of the market. One of the key reasons why I'm here is that I'm one of the top 5 advertisers of this man right here, of Google in Europe, and I have plenty of great anecdotes about that. And kidding aside, let's get started. I think the first thing that I would like to tie back together with what Tim said and what Fiona just said is that AI is going to be a transformational shift, both for B2C companies like my company as well as for B2B companies. And I fully agree with the premise that chips, cloud infrastructure, models, application layer, and then ultimately customer access will determine the game. I think what I can see today is that the customer access piece is going to be the most important one to be regulated. And here I would slightly nuance what Tim said in his speech earlier. We need to be capable in Europe of having 2 thoughts at the same time. Yes, we do need to encourage entrepreneurship. We do need to have more GetYourGuides. We do need to have more people taking risks and growing internationally. At the same point in time, my company will not have the cash flows to invest internationally unless big tech is heavily regulated. And we need to do both of these things at the same time. Now, why is that the case? I'll give you a very concrete example. The open internet as we know it, and on which I built my company in 2010, is dead. GetYourGuide could not be built again today. Why is that? Because back in those days, when you had a new service, you were selling something new, like experiences. We were the first ones to digitize the Louvre, or the Eiffel Tower, or the Spree River cruise here. You could build software, put it on the web, and reach distribution through Google. Back then, there were lots of organic search results. People could find your service. If they liked it, they could book, and they could stick. Google has since killed that open internet by gradually monopolizing the first page and going against what the founder, Sergey Brin, actually said of trying to route people to the best service and increasingly keeping people in their own walled garden, leveraging the data that they get from all their different properties in order to increasingly personalize the service. And then over time, even taking against the explicit will, the data of their key advertisers like us to further enrich the service. Now, why is that important in the context of AI? Because AI will supercharge that behavior. Even today, I can only tell you in the last 10 years, the level of transparency and control that we as an advertiser have received from Google has dramatically reduced. I don't even know where I'm spending my money on anymore on Google. I just give them a feed and they send me a bill at the end of the month. It's almost like an electricity power plant that can basically determine its own pricing. That is what we face today. And with AI, this will become even more opaque because ultimately the agent, which is going to be bundled within the Chrome service or within Android or any other upstream Google service, will determine what answer is going to be spit out, which advertiser is going to be displayed, and which price the advertiser has to pay. This is not free and fair and open competition. And unless that will get regulated, we will not stand a fighting chance of keeping consumers within our ecosystem, even if you have a very strong brand like we do. And that is why I can only implore on the regulators to take this incredibly seriously. Now in Germany, and I'll leave it with that, when I gave this pitch already 10 years ago, when we saw where the train was moving, and this was already moving in this direction before AI, everyone said, GetYourGuide, or maybe in Germany we have another e-commerce platform called Zalando, who has exactly the same point of view and the same problem. You guys, so like you're small companies anyways, we have B2B, like Tim just said, we have the B2B, this is what counts. Now, guess what? The same game is going to happen in B2B as well. Because at the end of the day, who controls the access to all of these companies? It's again Google, it's Microsoft. And if the data is going to be fed into the cloud at the US hyperscaler, ultimately they will ask for more and more data. They will try to rebuild the processes just like they did on the B2C side as well. And then the value ultimately will flow into the US hyperscaler and will no longer sit with the local German company.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Oli, to give you some time to reflect, I'm going to move to Udbhav, and because Johannes, you mentioned AI chatbots, but Udbhav, let's up the scale and talk about agentic AI and get your sense about what are the implications there, and then we will proceed.
Thank you. When analyzing the implications of autonomous agentic AI systems, we must recognize that we are fundamentally evaluating and navigating a fundamental architectural shift in how human intent is processed and expressed on the internet today. Historically, operating systems and browsers were relatively neutral resource managers. You explicitly directed them, and they executed your commands largely in order to preserve your interests. Agentic AI, especially when it's being incorporated into the operating system level, but also elsewhere on the web, fundamentally transforms many of these layers into active, goal-oriented infrastructures that can autonomously intercept, interpret, and execute user intent before it even reaches the broader web. And I think it's this intercept, interpret, and execute user intent that most of the risk that I'm going to be talking about comes from. From a market dynamics perspective, this is the ultimate form of disintermediation. When an OS-level AI agent becomes the primary interface between the user and the digital world, the upstream tech giant ceases to be merely a gatekeeper. It becomes an unavoidable, opaque bottleneck. If an agent is making autonomous decisions on a user's device and on a user's behalf, whether it's booking flights, selecting which messaging application to use, summarizing news from which particular sources, it is effectively replacing individual choice, organic discovery, and digital agency with automated recommendations and actions that are engineered to favor many various interests, but almost certainly not just the users. This aggressive integration locks out smaller and independent innovators and also places many applications, such as ours, Signal, at risk. It creates an environment where downstream application developers are entirely dependent on the benevolence of the operating system provider just to be seen or to be utilized in the way that they intended by the users. However, the competitive implications that I've just described are also inexorably linked to the privacy implications, particularly when we look at how these agentic systems are fundamentally being deployed in modern ways. To function autonomously, these agentic systems require comprehensive real-time understanding of user behavior, what the user's data or information is, what the user's payment methods are, who are the people and individuals and websites that the user generally interacts with. And many of these upstream providers are actively pushing to integrate these agents directly into the operating system layer because it simply makes it much easier to be able to paint this vast picture of the user's actions and the user's intent. And we must definitely call this out for what it is, which is pervasive OS-level surveillance, where it almost doesn't matter whether it's happening on the cloud or happening on the device. The autonomy of many of these agents amplify the systemic risk that is inherent in these systems because they operate continuously and often without granular or context-specific user permission. They capture data before it is encrypted, for example, and sometimes after it is decrypted when it reaches the user's final device. For meticulously engineered applications like Signal, which, for example, rely on very strict cryptographic guarantees, This OS-level surveillance presents a pretty existential vulnerability. According to us, some of these practices render application-level privacy, such as end-to-end encryption, structurally moot, because ultimately, the operating system is the waters that an application like Signal swims in. By establishing a centralized high-value target for attackers, like many of these agentic systems also create, and the collection of telemetry and other data about how these applications are being used, these deployment strategies can fundamentally undermine the capacity for genuine human agency and place the fundamental right to privacy at grave risk. Today, we are rapidly consolidating into a reality where the foundational infrastructure of all of the devices, whether we're a consumer or a business, is soon going to start acting as an adversarial agent on behalf of an ecosystem gatekeeper rather than the user who is utilizing the device. The implications for this are dire and can structurally foreclose both privacy and competition, and we must take both equally seriously.
Thank you so much. So, Oli, there are probably, if I try to group the issues that were mentioned, there are two elements that are very interesting. One is the future of intermediation or the possible disintermediation. And the other one, and this kind of follows from Fiona's comments mostly, is whether, in your opinion, Google or similar tech giants are leaving enough space for downstream competition. So both are kind of interrelated, but I think all of us would very much appreciate your views.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I suppose, reflecting on some of the comments I've already heard in this panel, I suppose as big tech, you have a choice in these kinds of debates to sort of turn your back on the feedback or turn up and engage with the discussion and the criticisms. We choose to turn up. For the record, I do not personally receive Johannes's advertising budget. That goes to Google. And I say that because just to sort of make another point that's related to me and why I'm here. You know, I come here as a representative of Google, but I also come here as someone who's British. My wife is Finnish. As I've heard particularly the keynotes that we've had through the course of today, I'm very invested in the success of European businesses and companies. I feel very connected to Europe also, and I was very struck and inspired by some of those remarks. I also have two children, a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I think one of the things that they perhaps would agree with Fiona on is that there's an awful amount of change taking place in the ecosystem, and they're of course participating in that as what I suppose would be AI natives, and the pace of change is dramatic. And I think as Johannes recalls, an internet of 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that is not the experience for my 12-year-old and 14-year-old. It's changing very, very dramatically. Now, is that the prelude to a call for standing down the DMA and not looking at big tech companies? No, of course not. I think it's a prelude to saying that one needs to be cognizant of the fundamental ways in which the internet is changing. And Google, to recall Mr. Munt's comment in their opening remarks, is shaken by that new form of competition, as are many other players in the market. But I think it's worth underscoring that point, that there's an awful amount of change. To intermediation, disintermediation, agents and agentic. Perhaps just to start with sort of at least my definition of what these things mean. I think that the terms are used quite loosely. When we think about this at Google, you think about tools that help you as a means of collaboration, and tools at the other end of the spectrum that are sort of a closed loop of automation. And just to give a bit of a spectrum across which these agents are operating. And to put it in more real terms, the tool that allows me to seamlessly execute a decision that I have made. I would like to buy this thing now. I would like to book this thing now. The tool that helps me do research, but at some point I would like you to hand me off to the source. I'd like you to hand me off to another provider to understand what they can do for me in a differentiated way. And then I suppose the sort of furthest back is just a very high level. I want you to provide me with some guidance, some direction, and hand me off as quickly as possible. We operate across that spectrum, I think, when we talk about agents. In that space, there is a lot of competition now. It seems to be moving very quickly. Granted, you see a lot of the bigger agents are obviously on the front page of the newspapers very frequently, the Claudes, the Geminis, the ChatGPTs, Perplexity. What I will say is this, is that there's an awful lot of movement amongst those agents. We feel that very much at Google. It wasn't that long ago that we were being told that we were out of the race when it came to agents, and that ChatGPT, a company that reached 100 million users in 2 months, I think, compared to some years for services like Facebook, they had won the race. And then Gemini was back, and now it's Claude. Everyone's talking about Claude and Claude Code and Claude Cowork. So there is a lot of movement in that space. A number of things are informing that, I would say. Different ways of processing data, synthetic data, distillation is allowing opportunities for those players to move very quickly. Specialization, people are focusing on particular verticals, particular data types to provide a very specific niche service that's attractive to consumers. Coding has obviously been a frontier for this kind of competition across a lot of agents. And for Google, for the platform services across the board, I would say, we too are evolving those services to provide agentic functionalities. That's a response to competition. That's an inevitable response to competition. There is an expectation, taking my 12-year-old and 14-year-old as examples, there is an expectation that you will be able to converse with a search engine, that you will be able to converse with a spreadsheet, that you will be able to have that kind of interaction. That is where the technology is moving. What does that mean then for winners and losers in this space? Does it all necessarily consolidate to one or two of the big tech players? No, I would say, is the answer to that. I do think that in the natural and inevitable reduction in friction and search costs, those who simply provide a frictionful service will fall away. They will not be able to succeed in this space. But what space is left, I would posit, is for a variety of players who will still be able to provide a value add, whether it's through access to the data that they hold, whether it's through a specific understanding of their consumers. There are a variety of ways that we think will lead to an ecosystem of a variety of different players providing agentic services that consumers will find attractive and will want to use. And I'll end here. So what then is important in that environment? The protection of multi-homing opportunities, put most simply. The duties of neutrality, of interoperability, of data portability, duties that we understand well at Google. We have experience of those rules over many years at this point. Those will be tremendously important and will provide the opportunities, we think, for those kinds of agents to succeed.
And can I ask you, so there are different monetization strategies or business strategies. So we heard from Andy about the ecosystem. You know, the assumption that this will be the leading model. You have the one of scale. You have the one of, let's say, unique, very advanced AI. Do you agree with the general assumption that the ecosystem model, which Google is a good example of, will be the winning model in terms of that becoming the leading AI model?
No, as I say, I think that when we observe the ways in which consumers are interacting with agents, and I think you only have to look over the last 18 months or so to see the way in which people from not just the teenagers, but across probably plenty of the people in this room, the ways in which people are interacting with different types of agents. They are switching between them based on a variety of different features and specializations that they're offering. Perplexity, for example. Perplexity is a tool that's well known for being advanced when it comes to factuality. It's a factuality tool. There's a strong reputation for that. Claude now has a very strong reputation for being a tool for coders. Is well ahead. Absolutely. Claude Cowork now has a reputation for doing the job of policy advisors and lawyers. There are many of the tools which are moving into spaces based on specialized data sets, technologies that are designed for specific vertical use cases. And we think that they will have many opportunities to succeed in the same space. Okay, super.
Alexander, let's add another perspective, one of sovereignty, because, of course, in the European context, there is a whole discussion of where exactly we're heading. We are mainly downstream, but there is a lot of emphasis, a lot of investment, and many efforts to try and maybe capture more space upstream. What are your thoughts about this trajectory and the chances of success?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Oh, I hear myself. So as a humble retailer, obviously, when you walk down the aisle, you like to have a choice, right? You like to have your choice of cereals. And since I'm in a room full of competition lawyers and other lawyers, I think you would all agree if our current reality is that very few companies are dominating this market, you would consider it systemic risk that needs to be regulated. And from our perspective, it's not too late to invest in that field. We've seen this coming a while ago. This is why we invested in cloud and a sovereign cloud solution, as well as, of course, AI. And the train definitely hasn't left the station, right? So I'm sure some of you are familiar with Amira's law, where we sort of underestimate the impact of certain technologies in the short run and don't see what happens in the long run. And as Oliver from Google just said, there is so much dynamic in the market that we can't really foresee who will really prevail and dominate the market. So since we in Europe, from our perspective, managed to get one of the most complex and broad AI regulation into action, we should equally be capable of doing the same thing for the respective technology that follows our values. And if we want proof of that, maybe it's our own actions, but also, as Tim said earlier, where we're working together on the AI Gigafactory. And I want to elaborate on that in a couple of seconds. But the important thing is, I'm sure some of you have heard the news that a 65-year-old dude who won the Turing Awards from France just collected $1 billion to create a different kind of AI that is based on a world model, because he thinks the LLMs are basically already the past. That's a European that came up with the idea. And if you think about the foundations of AI, they were, we have a war in Ukraine, but if you really go back to where the foundations from AI come from, they're actually from Ukraine and certain mathematicians from Ukraine. A lot of people don't know that. And, a researcher at Technical University of Munich also laid the foundations for the T in ChatGPT. So we have everything that is there. And obviously we don't just need the regulation to start, because that's sort of is maybe the sentiment that we have developed in Europe, that, well, we can't really start acting if there is not really, if they're not really the regulatory guardrails. So we really need to be careful, especially when we start regulating technology, on where it sort of stifles growth and innovation, and where it ensures that it sort of follows our idea of how the future should look like. Because we are definitely in the gravitational shifts or fields of what we see happening in Asia and what we see happening in the US. So from a Schwarz Digits perspective, everything is on the table. We need to act, we need to work together, we need to build these ecosystems, and then we have all the options in the world. And the next, obviously everybody can train, for example, an LLM with the data that is out there. But the next shift right now is, of course, creating these other models for robotics and so on, where we have all these global market leaders that have all the data, and we just need to ensure that they do this on their own terms, and ensure that the data is not given away, because once it's out there, it's done. And I want to make two more points, if you allow me. The first one is, as Tim mentioned earlier, about the investments in the infrastructure. Basically, it's not only the data that is sort of the new oil, but also, of course, the compute infrastructure. And we are always celebrating these numbers of, oh yeah, there's this investment of, I don't know, 3 billion in Germany, or by 2040, 7.8 billion in Germany from another vendor. But the thing is, by 2040, by the way, if you combine all the investments. But if you look at what's happening in the US, it's like nothing. It's like 2-3% of what these companies are investing there. I mean, just think about it. 500-600 billion, what Tim mentioned, of what is being invested in the US. Just Microsoft alone is 130 billion, and those 2 billion that are invested in Germany, nothing compared to that, and that's the US alone. Then finally, we mentioned space before, and this is another growing concern that we should all have. I know it's quite a different topic than AI, but we already see something that is threatening the model of the telcos right now, right? So all these companies that were not telcos but that have launch capability are launching these constellations and are basically directly going after another important aspect of our digital future, meaning the communication, the connectors, even in remote places, again, enabling very new forms of digital innovation. And this is something, besides sort of our lack of, let's say, AI compute capability that we have right now in Europe, really concerns us and a lot of people a lot. We discussed a little bit at the Munich Security Conference that there is basically no launch capability available if we want to launch our own satellites into space. Try to get get your payload on the SpaceX rocket. Can wait a long time, and we don't really have those capabilities yet, and we don't want to create yet another dependency there. So, these are some of the things we are thinking about and what we should have on the radar. But clearly, to end sort of on a positive note, we have all the options, and there are new technologies coming out, every day that will probably make LLMs look very old 5 years from now. I mean, just think of what's happening right now in the quantum space and the convergence between quantum and AI, or what's happening in the wetware space, meaning you combine biological capabilities. We just saw it the other day of a startup in Australia that combined silicon with brain cells. I mean, and the brain, let's not forget that the brain is still the most power efficient AI out there in the world compared to all these power hungry
at least for the next year or so. Johannes, you wanted to
yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on what Ollie had to say. So first of all, I also have 2 young kids, and I'm not as optimistic as you are, because I do believe that their future is hugely imperiled by big tech, because you are robbing competitiveness. And there was also something that you just said that is just, so we have roughly 80 million unique visitors a month. So I have a pretty broad view in terms of where the traffic comes from, different players in the ecosystem. And the narrative that this is a very dynamic field is false. It's never been dynamic. It's been completely constant. It's true that in the US only, ChatGPT was rising a little bit in traffic roughly 18 to 12 months ago, until you rolled out AI summaries, then it stopped. And what happened with AI summaries, suddenly all of the traffic for all of the publishers which were advertising for GetYourGuide, so the local travel blog in Greece or whatever, they got clobbered. Basically, they died overnight. They all went out of business because people now stopped at the AI summaries. And the next move that you made, and this is now killing OpenAI in my opinion, or at least they need to be heavily propped up by SoftBank and Amazon and everyone else who backs them, is that you are bundling AI mode with the Chrome browser. The Chrome browser, which just recently, I think even in the US, was subject to be split off from Google. So for me, I mean, I'm a relatively young guy, but I still remember Microsoft in the 90s, they weren't allowed to put the Internet Explorer on top of Windows. AI mode in Chrome is that quadrupled, because you basically have direct bundling at the top of the funnel, and then you get all of the data privileges from basically locking in people into your chatbot right away. So, excuse me, but I don't buy it. Perplexity is a rounding error, has always been a rounding error. ChatGPT is a rounding error. Google's market share is completely untouched. In fact, it is now increasing again. And you're even celebrating that on your own earnings calls. Well, it's true. Have you checked? So Google search has made $220 billion US in the last 12 months, growing close to 20% year over year. That's not exactly losing or a very dynamic market environment, sorry to say.
Let me try doing the theory of harm. Is
Yeah.
that okay? All right. So I think that let's pretend we wanted to do enforcement in this space to keep competition going. We would need to be quite fast and nimble because the technology is moving. Let me point out that Johannes is talking about a consumer channel. There are other uses of AI, business to business, and so on, which are not implicated in this theory of harm that we're talking about here. But first, we need to be fast and nimble. Second, we know that some players are dominant already. We already had a court case about that. We can take that for granted, and that might speed us up a little bit. Third thing is that we need to take into account the fact that it's an ecosystem this time and not just a product. So for example, my research assistant was very amused by the fact that he's trying to learn how to use Claude, because of course I'm not going to use Gemini. And so he's on YouTube with videos, instructional videos on how to use Claude, and every single ad is for Gemini. And so that he reported that as an interesting fact. We also know the size of these corporations, their ability to lobby, their ability to litigate, and we have to build that into enforcement. And we also know how remedies can be hijacked and designed by the defendant, and we have to plan for that also. So let me give you the two quick sketches of the theories of harm. Johannes has basically given you one already, which is bundle Chrome and AI overviews and search, and say to content providers, if you want to be in the search results, you have to let me, Google, scrape your website to build my AI tool and my AI overviews. The publisher gets most of its traffic, or a lot of its traffic, from Google Search. Google Search is a monopoly, and so there is no place else to turn for that traffic. So that tie works because there's a lot of market power on the side of getting into the search results. So the publisher gets scraped, then Google uses that publisher content to train the AI and build a substitute for the publisher, which is the overview. Then the user clicks on reads the substitute, doesn't go to the content provider, so it's traffic foreclosure through the tie, and then that means that the content provider doesn't get any business, exits, or doesn't grow, or doesn't have investment. The harm to the consumer is less provision of content, less variety, lower quality, and eventually a general equilibrium AI slop on the internet, because if there's nobody putting content out there, then Google scraping the internet is scraping itself, and it goes round and round, and we get garbage. Okay, so that's theory of harm number one. Theory of harm number two is just broadly more AI. So tie AI to search and to Chrome. It's a default at the top of the page. Google gathers data. There's more data for Google than anyone else. Gemini gets better relative to others. Contract again with Apple. We saw that last week, so that now Gemini is the only AI tool on the Apple handset. So you have, once again, the Android handset, the Apple handset, exclusive defaults. And this is not different than the last case we built about search and Google. And then it's important to not have interoperability, and then you're done. I mean, so those are the two theories of harm.
Super, so we're done. Oli, I mean, the way to... So what should we do with our shares? Should we sell the Google shares and buy intermediaries? Or should you sell shares in intermediaries and buy Google?
I think we all need to buy Google.
I think that you should make your own investment decisions.
No, but do feel free to comment.
I mean, there's so much. Where to begin? Okay, so I think it would be naive to suggest that the theories of harm that have been laid out by Fiona quite well, I think, are theories of harm that you can pretend that do not exist, but they're theories of harm and they need to be proven out. And I think when we look at the US judgment, I think is invoked fairly as a basis for getting past the dominance discussion. What is interesting in that judgment, Judge Mehta's judgment, is the fact that when it comes to remedies, the judge is very clear about the influence of AI and what that means for his determination of what an appropriate remedy would look like. And I would, rather than recounting all of those paragraphs, I would encourage you to look at that. This is not a case of Google being let off the hook. This is a case of a judge looking at the market, making determinations as to market power, but being particularly careful as to the nature of the interventions that he will recommend, as the most recent judge to have looked at these issues, when it comes to providing a remedy. And it seems a little awkward to me to accept the dominance but to reject the remedies, but that's a personal view. More generally, though, I think, as I say, that the theories of harm that Fiona lays out are ones that you have to engage with as Google. And I will take just one, which is the very important, and I think societally important question of how do content creators engage with big platforms who are using their content. I think it's a very reasonable and fair discussion, a necessary discussion to have, which is why we are having it. The questions of how you provide proper attribution, the questions of how you provide proper controls, the questions of how you provide fair and reasonable compensation. Those are all being discussed in some detail. Competition and Markets Authority in the United Kingdom is in the middle of a consultation that we are engaging with. The European Commission is looking at similar issues. So to pretend that those theories of harm are irrelevant and ought to be ignored by me would be unreasonable, but also to suggest that we are not engaging with them on the facts and the evidence would also be unreasonable. That's absolutely taking place. The notion of controls over content is something that we've publicly stated that we're working on with the Competition and Markets Authority. We wait for the consultation to finish, but we've said very clearly that's an important issue that we need to act on. So, you know, give us the time to engage with the theories, give us the time to speak to regulators who will have full access to the data and information about the nature of the traffic flows.
You can't say give us the time. I mean, that's completely not fair.
The consultation finishes in weeks. Yes, I mean, this is what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm not asking for 10 years of Google shopping, yes? I'm asking you for 3 or 4 weeks. Give us the time to engage with the theories.
And
I think, as I say, the notion of dynamism and movement and rapid innovation in this space launches coming at a white heat speed, I would say, across all of the technology companies, including Google, means that, you know, we have to act with alacrity in our engagement with the regulators, and that's very well understood. But to say that at the same time, there was an analogy earlier to sort of a Gulliver environment of hundreds of lines holding you down. You have to have the time to be able to engage with those things, right? To be able to come with solutions ready-made to the fast-moving innovations is, I think, very optimistic. But that, of course, doesn't mean that one doesn't have to engage.
Okay. Now, you wouldn't guess it, but the world of AI is not just Google. So we're going to move beyond Google and explore now a little bit more on the regulatory front. And Andy, maybe we should hear from you some insights on what were your thoughts of the way to engage in terms of enforcement and regulation with AI.
Okay, thank you, Ariel. I think as an enforcer, it might not be appropriate for me to jump in and debate and to take sides. So I try to be neutral. So can you put up the second slide? As an enforcer, we always need to give some report after conducting this public consultation. So this is basically the 4 principal major policy implication we draw from our public consideration. So as you can see on the slide, in the future, we probably need to clarify the disputes. By clarifying dispute, it means that we need to determine whether the dispute is a competition issue and could be effectively addressed by competition law. Because in the public consultation, we find out that, of course, the AI giants enjoy financial advantage over the small and medium-sized companies, but that facts not necessarily will be translated into a competition issue. Because some of the issue might be more appropriately addressed by, for example, industrial policy, by government's policy to create an incentive mechanism to induce the AI investment. So if that is the case, that may not be appropriate for the competition agency to jump in. And once the issue has been determined as a competition issue, then we need to substantiate the theory of competitive harm. The reason for that is because, as we can see there, the quickly expanding theory about how generative AI could harm competition. So as a competition agency, we need to substantiate first what kind of competition theory of competitive harm could be applied in a specific case. That is important for subsequent evidence collection and also very important for the efficient use of enforcement resources. And of course, the experience from the foreign jurisdiction is very important, but we also think that the enforcement strategy should also take into account the technological difference at the local market, and measure that difference against each jurisdiction's local context. And also because the public consultation revealed a more kind of reserved view toward early intervention. So I think the TFTC think at this moment, I think maintaining market contestability could still be the ideal framework for us, or enforcement principle for the competition agency to enforce competition in the AI market. And finally, I think the TFTC also think that because as you can see, there are very divergent view toward each question. So at this moment, I think rule of reason approach might still be better for the enforcement agency to delve into the controversy that arising from the generative AI system. And of course, by saying that, it also creates a very huge challenge for the enforcement agency. So I think each competition agency need to strengthen or optimize their digital enforcement skill. And in the case of TFTC, we are expanding our resources, both software and hardware within our agency, to better handle those digital cases that will predictably will come to our agency in the future. So I think I can share this the initial enforcement principle, and I need to emphasize that is based on the public consultation, and we would probably will revise it on a rolling basis as the market consideration changed. Of course, the enforcement principle need to be advised as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy, because these are really helpful general insights on the direction that we would like to see enforcement evolve. Udbhav, when we speak about these general principles of what it is that we're looking for in terms of enforcement, in your area, when we think about human autonomy, decision-making, privacy, what kind of things would you like to see in terms of enforcement?
Thank you. If we're to meaningfully protect...
We cannot hear you. You're muted, possibly.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now.
Great. If we are to meaningfully protect human autonomy, decision-making, and competition, I think our first regulatory intervention must really be to abandon the magical thinking that corporate self-regulation or superficial transparency reports are sufficient just because the market is moving really quickly. I think what we are seeing is a situation where there is a very real risk of pretty systemic infrastructure capture, and the enforcement toolbox must necessarily deploy remedies that are both structural in nature and also account for the nature and the power of the technology, and not merely wait for the market to sort itself out because there are there's change that is taking place in the market. I think we've seen the consequences of not doing that in time quite a lot in the last maybe 20 years on the internet in many ways. And if anything, I think a lot of the ways in which AI technologies in general, but also agentic technologies in particular, are only going to accelerate that trend. So from Signal's perspective, the first primary sort of intervention is that we believe that we really want regulators to play a pretty active role in advocating for something called developer agency. Given the fact that operating systems are moving from being relatively neutral arbiters to becoming entities that will both enable users to interact with applications in different ways, but also make choices on behalf of users that users may not necessarily understand. We think application developers should be granted the technical and the legal right to explicitly block and control how agents and agentic systems interact with themselves and from the user data that these applications contain. So maybe I'll just give you a concrete example. We think it should be possible for Signal, the application, to be able to say, it doesn't matter whether it's an agentic system that's incorporated into an operating system. It doesn't matter whether it's something that's accessing it via the web. The default should be that the developer of the application gets the ability to say it's okay for the agentic system to interact with it or not, and that the user should have the ability to override that decision. But rather than being default opt-in, it should become it should be a default opt-out, so that it becomes something that as you're interacting with these systems, it becomes pretty clear that the way that the agency is exercised is still within the user's control and not something that is left open on a case-by-case basis, like I think we're seeing in the world today. And for us, this is sort of really the baseline to be able to ensure that we can still make many of the privacy guarantees that we do to our users. Because without those guarantees, we are very much in a scenario where, because of the fact in the analogy that I used earlier, these are the waters that we swim in. Those waters end up becoming poisoned, and they will ultimately end up poisoning the application itself. And that's something that we have to be quite careful about. And the second thing is that we actually do think that it's quite important to leverage markets, like frameworks like the Digital Markets Act, the DMCC in the UK, and similar legislation that are coming elsewhere, because it's pretty clear that what AI technologies are certainly doing is catalyzing market power in very new and interesting ways. I think that taking remedies that already exist in these laws, such as, prohibiting gatekeepers from connecting like telemetry, where I think agentic systems just end up providing another ambit to collect information, because it's now no longer just what the user is doing, but what a technical system is doing, and you can like fine tune what it collects and the kind of information it sends back to the gatekeeper with a lot more granularity than I think if it's just user interaction. And making sure that this information doesn't end up being collated with, the broader advertising ecosystems, the broader like social media ecosystems that many of these gatekeepers also operate in, so that there is more compartmentalization in the kind of data that is collected and the kind of capabilities that these agentic systems will be able to exercise. I think that a really, really important bit, and this is something that like I think is there in many of these laws, but honestly probably should be made much sharper, is to make sure that operating system vendors don't end up self-preferencing their own models versus the models of other competitors. I think it's actually quite likely that we're going to see a pretty strong push from both OpenAI and Anthropic to make sure that this is the case. But whether it's a small startup in Berlin or one of the larger like independent AI labs, making sure that a model that is running on a device has the access to the same capabilities, access to the same interfaces at the operating system level, and access to the same interfaces in the web to be able to carry out actions on behalf of a user, to make sure that there's actually competition, is really, really, I think, important. And the final point there is I think that the effectiveness of many of these interventions is only something that we can be sure about if we can technically verify them. And that will only take place if we make sure that as these systems and these technologies are being built out, that we protect independent adversarial research into how a lot of these systems operate. AI technologies inherently are quite black box in nature. And unless we invest efforts in building frameworks that enable auditability, that allow specific interfaces for how, say, agentic systems interact with user data, ways in which agentic systems interact with actions that they perform onto the internet, so that competition regulators, privacy regulators, and just civil society in generally can hold these things to account and make sure they understand, even if they can't understand why they're carrying out the actions that they do, they can at least definitely understand how they are carrying those actions out, is going to be essential for competition regulation. And we're increasingly going towards a world where many of these things are becoming more and more black boxes, even than the ones that have been so far. And making sure they happen in open, interoperable, and standardized ways is going to end up becoming really, really important.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And Alexander, let's add another layer and reflect on the issue of sovereignty and to the extent to which you believe that either European regulation or member state regulation can play a role in both promoting competition law but also European sovereignty.
Well, I mean, in the short run, the regulation will not result in sovereignty, right? Because all these regulations are guardrails, but they not necessarily influence the creation of a single European market. Because what creates sovereign solutions are essentially financially stable and very strong companies that are essentially are able to win a lot of customers, whether they're B2B or B2C customers. And so the regulators need to ensure that we not only have technology-specific regulations, but that we as Europeans take advantage of what is most, should be most dear to us and as one of our, strongest assets. And this is our diversity, but also our strong market in terms of the amount, the population size, but also the economic dynamic. And we are still not there, right? So it's very difficult to scale up the company. And you know, it's telling that a friend of mine created an AI company in construction in the US, and her investors basically told her, hey, please don't go to Europe because the market in the US is bigger. We ensure that you grow big there, and then maybe eventually you go to Europe. But that tells us a lot, right? Because they, of course, and we have discussed this now for the past 2 years, also again at a Munich Cybersecurity Conference, you can really see this with our transatlantic partners, that they're not really happy about the regulations. But then again, if everybody's complaining about something, you're onto something there, right? But the key thing is really sovereignty requires us to build solutions that scale across Europe, and then it also requires us to select these solutions and support them, whether these are anchor partners. You heard Tim stating earlier that the government has made some, or the European Commission also made some statements of reducing the amount of anchor partnership. And that is, of course, something that is not so advisable, right? And then again, it is up on the leaders of the various organizations to say, well, I'm going to buy Europe. So we will see some regulations right now, and the update of the European Procurement Directive or regulation that is sort of trying to build in more capabilities on the government side to go to bid for European companies. But of course, the market will react, right? I sometimes, I'm not sure whether I can make that statement, but of course, sometimes we Europeans that work for non-European companies can also undermine our attempt to be more sovereign and foster European tech and other companies, because we want to still pay our mortgage and still have a job, and this is why we will find workarounds of making the organizations and the products we work for more sovereign. And maybe that's okay, because you start an ecosystem of maybe global leading technology that also takes advantage of sovereign infrastructure and solutions. And we see this happening right now as Schwarz Digits. But at the end of the day, the regulation itself will not just automatically create sovereignty.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to end, but what I would like to do is allow each of our panelists to have a final soundbite, either on regulation, if you have any additional thought about regulation, or on competitiveness. And one way to look at it is whether you think that we are likely to leave the next generation a more competitive market, or whether you believe that the next generation is likely to face a more concentrated market, less dynamism. So, Andy, would you like to start? So we'll have to do it quite brief.
Okay, thank you. I think I owe you an answer for the first question. You mentioned about a challenge. So I want to talk briefly about a challenge. I think we may have very different view regarding whether the AI market we are moving toward ecosystem competition. But suppose it is true, the statement is true, then there will be a very specific, very huge challenge for enforcement agencies. I will just briefly mention two challenges. The first one is how an enforcement agency evaluate the interplay between the what I call the intra-ecosystem competition and also the ecosystem competition. And theoretically speaking, with the competition for the market theory versus the competition in the market theory help us in making this kind of assessment. I think that's a bigger challenge. And also, what if a company in the future, he asserted that the restraint of the competition within the across the ecosystem within the ecosystem is to enhance the quality of the inter-ecosystem competition. So to what extent can we learn from the conventional teachings, such as the restraining intra-brand competition to promote inter-brand competition? And second challenge would be, there is a common theme running through all these challenges, and that is innovation. How can an enforcement agency evaluate the contribution from innovation to mitigate or sometimes aggravate the competitive problems in the AI competition? I think that's even a bigger challenge for the enforcement agency. And we currently is undertaking a research project, and we hope the academia could provide some answer for us for future enforcement.
Thank you so much, Andy. Oli, last soundbite.
Very quickly, I'm not sure if it's a soundbite, but in less than a minute, I suppose a couple of observations. Digital Markets Act, competition regulation, it is but one tool in the box, right? We've talked about many different tools to encourage productivity and growth. DSA, DMA, AIA, IAA, the list goes on. R&D investment, capital markets, all of these are going to be contributors to improving productivity and growth. So hope that is something we hold on to, and for the competition rules to be used in the right places to motivate growth. Very quickly, on the competition rules, I think focus is very important. Digital Markets Act itself is some 22 rules. That is a lot of rules. We have 8 core platform services. If you are asking companies like Google to focus and move quickly, think about where the focus ought to be. We've talked a lot today about things like access to compute. Compute's not in the DMA yet. We talk about portability, interoperability. How should we be prioritizing those things to focus on when the legislation itself is such a huge amount of scaffolding around our business? And finally, when we're making those decisions about where to focus and how to intervene, how do we make this measurable? I mean, that's a big question for us at Google. The ways of measuring the value add of our integrations, the ways of measuring the value add of the competing ecosystem who's asking for prominence, the ways of valuing the content that's being put into these models. These questions of measurability are absolutely crucial at the moment, and I will close on this. I think now is the time for engineers and economists. This is the moment for them to be engaging in this debate and focusing on the metrics that will demonstrate whether or not the rules are fit for purpose and achieving what we want.
Lovely. You mentioned economist, Fiona.
Okay, great. I think it's important to remember that artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology, so it's put into all kinds of products and services, and these products and services are often already regulated. So if we have a regulation about safety or about interoperability, then we have to make sure that the new version of the product that includes AI is complying with those regulations that we have already. So for example, in the DMA, if AI is in search or messaging or in intermediation, then that doesn't change the obligations of the DMA. And the DMA has a built-in market investigation and can adjust itself, and that's a wonderful capability, and we should be using that. I would say I'm a fan in general of light touch regulation, by which I mean things like open interfaces, which is largely what the DMA is about, and regulatory oversight of a kind that lets the regulator have a lot of access to information and the ability to get that information as it wants so that it can keep governments apprised of risk and keep track of what new technologies are and what they might be doing. And I think measurement and verification, as a couple of others have said, is extremely important. A bit more use of audits paid for by the corporation, the platform being regulated, that allow the government to verify that what it says it's doing, it's actually doing.
Thank you so much, Johannes.
In the closing statement, I'll answer your question on the markets. So, would you invest in Google or the intermediaries is something else. The reality is the markets are currently speaking. Intermediaries are tanking. Booking.com, Airbnb, everyone else is going down in stock price. Google is at 4 trillion. So what is a parameter of success that investors have confidence again that you can build applications that become competitive within Google's or others' ecosystems, and that will only happen when customer access gets regulated. The regulation, as Fiona said, is already there. It's called the DMA. There are preliminary findings. It's very focused. Just execute them. You can do it. We need to execute it. It's been in the drawer for 2 years. We've had plenty of discussions. We actually even have agreements partially on what should be done, but it's not being executed. And obviously, Google and other big tech gatekeepers will always kick the can down the road. Do not allow them to kick the can down the road, execute the DMA.
Thank you. Udbhav, very quickly, last statement, 30 seconds, please.
Sure. I mean, I just think that it's important to also remember that competition and privacy are often looked at as mutually exclusive, but in reality, I think the way that we are seeing many of these AI and agentic systems being deployed in the recent past is that we are speed running many of the lessons that we've learned in privacy, competition, and cybersecurity backwards, forgetting many of the lessons that we've learned. And it's vital that rather than treating them as mutually exclusive, we look at them as together. And rather than falling for many of the arguments that we have in the past and whose price we've paid, that we treat them as mutually reinforcing so that we end up in both a safer and a more competitive world.
Lovely. Alexander, you have the last word.
Oh, that's very kind. Let me make 3 points. I think we learned that from Steve Jobs, right?
Please make them in 20 seconds. People here are dying for coffee.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm the one keeping you from it. But we also make great coffee. So first point is we have great regulations here in Europe. I think we have enough for now. We need to ensure that we just start acting in Europe and don't lose our hope, but use all our capabilities to build our own future. That's the key thing. And honestly, this is sort of a reminder to everyone who is in a leadership position to take advantage of everything we have, the people, the technology, and the processes to create a brighter European future, even though it feels doomed. And then another point is for the enforcement agencies or the market watchdogs, AI will also help you to look after all those big tech companies. So you also have a great, more efficient, bright future ahead of you. Thank you.
Okay. I'm glad that you ended with a positive note. There was a bit of a dip in the middle, but we'll ignore that. Please, everyone, join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.